Greetings and welcome to episode 21 of a Plain Accounts web series, where every week we discuss at least one of this coming Sunday's lectionary passages. Today we are looking at John 13:31 through 35, the Gospel pericope for the fifth Sunday of Easter. As always, I'm here with Ben Kramer. Ben, do you want to say hello?
Hello, it's good to be here.
And we have with us today Ryan Quanstrom, somebody I know fairly well. Ryan was our contributor for the essay for the John essay on the website this week. Ryan, why don't you say hello? Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, how you're serving.
Hello, I'm Ryan. Like Danny said, we know each other pretty well, seeing as I taught him everything that he knows. So, being the big brother that I am in Wyoming, Michigan at the Clyde Park Church of the Nazarene. Moved up here in October of this year. It's been a wonderful time serving this community, getting to know the greater Grand Rapids area.
Wonderful. And thanks for your essay this week, Ryan. I loved it. It has very much informed how I will be preaching this Sunday, and we're glad to chat with you about this pericope today.
Cool.
Well, let me go ahead and read for us John chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. And it might be worth mentioning that you may have preached on this not too long ago. On Maundy Thursday, we read these verses and then some. The passage for Maundy Thursday was John 13, 1 through 17, then 31b through 35. So let me read these verses again, these familiar verses. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, so we can talk a little bit about the context, historical and literary. I think one thing to note right off the bat is in verse 31, it says, when he had gone out. When you're just reading this pericope, you need to know who that he is. Because I think we're inclined to interpret that as Jesus if we're just reading these verses, but it's Judas. Judas had gone out. He has gone out to betray Jesus. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said these things, which leads to the importance of this passage within its greater context. So let's talk a little bit about that. What do we need to know about these verses to prepare ourselves for preaching this Sunday?
This is a section that it's in the second half of John's Gospel, which, I mean, some talk about how the Gospel is all about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, but John has the longest narrative of that. Chapter 12 is kind of when that switch happens. So we have Jesus 6 days prior to this, or maybe 5 days. It's kind of hard to see the timeline. But 6 days before Passover is when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And so you have that miracle happen. And then at the beginning of chapter 13, you have it when it says that it's near the Passover. It doesn't exactly say how near it might be the Passover meal, but it doesn't say that. I mean, they're upstairs eating, but it says before the festival of the Passover. So it might not yet actually be the Passover meal, but it is that time of the year, and it is that season. And so I think locating that Jesus has just performed this incredible miracle, and they're near Passover, and they are in a room eating together, and the one who has just left is Judas.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting because this pericope is sandwiched between these two really horrific, terrible things. We know what's going to happen, I guess we should say. We know that it's right before this, Jesus says, "I'm going to be betrayed," and then Judas leaves. And then we'll see later on the actual betrayal, and then we'll see once again the denial of Peter. And one thing that I think it's important for us to note is that they're present in this pericope. Judas has just left, but What we've just seen in the previous verses is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. He has done this incredibly uh, uh, sacrificial and, I mean, ordinary. It's too typical of an act for a rabbi to do. It's too low of him, yet he takes on this role. And Ben, you could chat a little bit about that. But Judas and Peter are present in that, and now Jesus is saying to the disciples, "Love one another as I have loved you." Well, how did he love them? And we can talk about that in a little bit. But Ben, do you want to chat a little bit about that, kind of the historical context there regarding
Sure.
that act?
It's pretty countercultural. You would walk into a room in first century Palestine to have the meal already set, the table ready to be sat at to consume the meal. And then there would be a servant there whose assumed role would be to wash the hands and the feet of those who would come to eat for sanitary reasons. So it was an assumed role, just like your Starbucks barista getting you coffee. When you walk into a Starbucks, you assume they're going to help you and serve you coffee. If I went and took on an apron when I entered into Starbucks to make my own coffee or to serve my friends who would come with me, it would have been a very countercultural, odd thing for me to do. And on top of this, the disciples saw Jesus as rabbi, as teacher, as Lord. And so for him to take on the role of that servanthood that in that place was just kind of cataclysmic in their minds to think about. It just struck them as odd, which is why we have Peter's response. You shouldn't do this.
Right.
Then when he found out what Jesus was about, he wanted to have Jesus wash him completely from head to toe. And we start to think about our baptism at that point, and Jesus is like, you need me to allow me to serve you in the ways that you need to be served right now. Your feet are dirty, and I need to clean them. Allow me to serve in that way. And you get this really stark contrast then where, yes, Jesus washed Judas' feet, and he goes into talking about loving one another, and you see Judas going to betray Jesus. And I think an important thing to understand there is why. Why is Judas trying to betray Jesus? And I think some scholarship has shown that Judas was one who wanted to push Jesus into a violent reaction. It wasn't so much that he wanted to leave Jesus. He thought that Jesus was going to be a military messiah and overthrow like the Maccabees. And so if he betrayed Jesus, it would push the envelope into Jesus being the divine military messiah for him to overthrow Rome. And so that's his definite... What's that?
He's forcing Jesus' hand.
Forcing his hand, exactly. Because he doesn't think of Jesus serving in the way that Jesus has come to serve. And so you see Judas going out to betray, to force Jesus' hand, and then you hear Jesus saying, "No, a new command I give to you, to serve, to love one another."
Right. And so that's an important context that's framing this pericope. In order for us to preach this passage, we have to know what's been going on beforehand. And so then Jesus says, multiple times, the Son of Man has been glorified. God has been glorified. If God has been glorified, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. First of all, the syntax of this is bizarre, both in the English and in the Greek. Because in the Greek, it has twice in that verse 32 there, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. It's hard to know who these hymns are. Who is being glorified in whom? And so when you have those double pronouns there, you kind of have to make an interpretive guess or use the context to help you out. But Jesus is talking so much about glorification here. And Ryan, you kind of commented a little bit on glorification and how we don't really comprehend or we don't have the same type of understanding of glorification. So talk a little bit about what this glorification means.
Yeah, when when we use glorification, which perhaps we ought to use our theological concept of glorification more, sometimes we conflate that with sanctification in our particular tradition. But usually when people use the term glorification theologically, they're speaking about our future reality when we are united with heaven, or when heaven comes to earth, when the heavenly city descends out of heaven, which is the Revelation passage. And so that's what we think of with glorification. But John uses glorify in a very particular way. The first time that John uses it is in chapter 8. And if I honor myself, my honor is nothing. If my Father that honors me, and there's honor there, there's also glory in that. And then there's not until, I think it's in chapter 11, when God's glory is united with Jesus' glory. And then within John's passage, John is very aware that he is writing a story, and that he is writing at a later date, because he'll include narrative clues like they did not remember these things until the Son of Man had been glorified. Mm-hmm. So he's very particular about saying, letting his readers know that he's aware that he is writing down this story. And so within this passage, the glorification of Jesus comes when he is lifted up, and it's not just when he's lifted up on the cross, but then when he is lifted up again out of the grave.
Right.
I think lots of people will they speak about the cross, though perhaps they don't speak about the cross in its proper context. I really appreciate Theodore Jennings' book where he says that we often lift the cross out of the ground in Transforming Atonement. He says we often talk about the cross, but we don't talk about the political ramifications of what the cross is. And I think that knowing that Jesus is glorified on the cross, which is a specific type of crucifixion reserved for the insurgents that Judas wanted Jesus to be, that is important to note, that Jesus' glorification there is not used to fight the powers and principalities of this world and the way that people want Jesus. But his glorification glorifies God and is a conquering of death.
Right. And so it's not escapism in any way.
Certainly not.
Oftentimes when we talk about glorification, we talk about it as this kind of fleeing of this earth, whatever. That would be maybe in a pop theology perspective. But here, glorification is the grave and resurrection, right? It's the atoning work of the death and the resurrection. That's glorification. That's not an avoidance. That's not escapism. That's real presence.
Well, and it is the example of servanthood.
Right.
Of self-sacrifice, of denying oneself.
Right.
One of the things that we also have to keep in mind when speaking about this passage is the genre or the type of literature that it is. This passage is located in what some call the final discourses, which start at the beginning when Jesus is addressing the apostles. They're all sharing this meal together, and it goes all the way through the end of chapter 17 when he's praying. In chapter 14, which is next week's pericope, you get the disciples asking questions. You have Peter ask questions. You have I think it's Thomas and Judas and Philip all ask questions. But otherwise, if you ever use one of those red letter Bibles, this is a section where they use most of their red ink.
Right.
There is just a lot of Jesus speaking.
Right.
With final discourses are that they work on the two levels, and I mentioned this in the essay. But Jesus is speaking directly to the hearers, and when Jesus speaks to the apostles in the upper room, his words mean something directly to them, given their immediate context. But as readers who know about the crucifixion and the resurrection, it will change how we understand Jesus' command to love one another as I have loved you. And it's that two-level of discourse. And in the essay, if you read it, you can see all of the other places in the Old Testament where this final discourse, Moses gives one and Joshua gives one. And so they could provide areas for research and for understanding this passage.
Right. Maybe one last thing before we dive into how do you then preach it, given all of this, is verse 34 is interesting. If you look at the original Greek, I give you a new commandment that you love one another. The New Revised Standard Version is what we read today, and the NIV is similar in that it translates this word hina in Greek as that. I give you a new commandment that you love one another. Commentators have noted that hina can be translated either as that or as in order that. I give you a new commandment in order that you love one another. So therefore, the new commandment would not necessarily be to love one another. The new commandment would be a specific way of loving one another. As you noted in your commentary, Ryan, the command to love one another is present in the Levitical Code. Leviticus 19:18, I believe, has that command to love one another. But then once again, in the second half of that verse, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. That word for should is the Greek word hina, which doesn't mean should, it means that, or it means in order that. So just as I have loved you, in order that you also love one another. So the new command is to love in a very specific kind of way, in the way that Christ has loved them. The new commandment is service. The new commandment is sacrifice. That is what Jesus is telling him, and by this they'll know you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
And if it is translated that way, it also gives some teleological purpose. There is Jesus is not just loving as an example, but he's loving with a goal in mind. So teleology that's imposed there that you don't get with should.
Right. So, okay. So in the next few minutes or so, how do we preach this? Knowing what we know about our culture, our context, how do we preach this, and what are some homiletical handles?
I think teaching out that purpose of love as serving one another, a preacher would do well in tying that in with the Revelation passage, that just as Judas has gone out to perhaps bring about a kingdom in his own way by forcing Jesus' hand, Jesus is then saying, no, essentially my kingdom will come about by my followers loving and serving one another in this way, in the way that I have loved and served. And when you parallel and juxtapose that with the Revelation passage, then we are called to live into that kingdom now. We are called, as Jesus has said, this commandment, to wipe every tear, to bring water to the thirsty, to serve, to bring food to the hungry, to clothe the naked. And that will be living into the kingdom that is coming. We are a goal-oriented people, and in order that we love one another in this way, we are called to serve as Jesus has served us. I think so many times in our culture we think I guess a majority of our prayers are, God, would you just meet us halfway? As if we're doing all of this work and God needs to pull his end of the bargain, when in reality, God has already gone all the way to the cross. God has gone completely to the extent that he can go. And so he's asking us to then go and give all of ourselves in this new commandment. And so I think juxtaposing that with Judas's actions and Christ's commandment, we can have a call to live into the kingdom of God here and now, not just waiting for the new thing to come in the future. The new thing has been done through Christ's death and resurrection.
And so there's that prolepsis.
Yes.
That proleptic anticipation. And you could, if you wanted to provide a homiletical handle, you could kind of give an example of how we speak proleptically in our lives. You get pulled over by a cop, oh, we're done for. You speak in the present tense about an event that hasn't yet happened. You live into that future thing. So you could provide a handle to comprehend that proleptic anticipation or that proleptic participation.
I'm going to start off with, hey, tell me, haven't you heard the word love? Love is a series. Let's go back to some DC talk from the 90s, because that's probably a place that most people will recognize.
Oh, DC talk.
Yes. No, I think that love, the importance of love in this passage is, the whole passage really centers on love.
Right.
And I think love in our culture is something that I don't know that we can ever stop talking about a correct understanding of love. There's just so many voices in our world that try to teach us what love might be or what love is. And a lot of popular culture, love is highly influenced by the romantics. And so we have, my favorite punching bag is Jerry Maguire, You Complete Me, where you are not actually somebody else, but you are an extension of myself, and that's why I love you.
Yeah.
But
Justin Timberlake's Mirror is another good example of that.
What's that?
Justin Timberlake's song Mirror. Because it's like my mirror. I love you because you reflect me.
Oh, I didn't know that one.
Yeah.
I need to brush up on my Timberlake.
Gotta get your JT going on.
No, seriously. I'll wear a suit and tie as I do that.
There you go.
But I really think that love is one of those things that we expect it from others, and we are upset when others don't love, and I think we often misinterpret the second greatest commandment, which is love your neighbor as yourself. We often love our neighbor as our neighbor has loved us.
Right.
And so I think that it wouldn't be a bad thing to talk about, to use this as an opportunity to talk about what Christ-like love is and what love in the body is. What does it mean for the church to have love for itself?
Right, because Jesus says, love one another. I mean, this is within the community of disciples. Love one another. He's not. It doesn't mean we don't love those who are not in the disciples. That's not the implication. But it's explicitly about love for the church. So you could talk about family disputes and how often families bicker with each other because they're safe, because they don't feel like they're going to get left by their family members. So they take out their frustrations on the family. And how often does that happen in our churches? People take certain frustrations out on the church because it's like a family to them, and so they treat it like that. But Jesus says, no, love one another first. But then something else you said, Ryan, the type of love that Jesus expresses, I think we see here it's twofold in this pericope. In these verses, we see, knowing the context of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, you see this incredibly ordinary, mundane, low-level service. Jesus loves the disciples in a way that he probably shouldn't, in a way that was too ordinary for him to love them. And so one of the things we need to ask our churches are we willing to wash each other's feet? Are we willing to serve one another in the most ordinary, typical things? Because you don't have a meal without having washed feet, right? Like, you just do that every time you have a meal. So, will we love each other in those super ordinary ways? But then Jesus also says, this is my glorification, meaning his death, impending death and resurrection. Will we also love one another with that self-sacrificial love to the very end? And what? So
it's not just the feet I want to wash either.
Right.
You wash Judas and Peter's feet as well,
right,
who would betray and deny him. So are we willing not only to do the menial task, but do the menial task for everyone?
In our churches.
In our churches. Yeah.
The person in this church that really frustrates you, we wash their feet.
And I think there's even room to talk about, not that, we shouldn't view the church necessarily only as a building, but are you willing to take out the garbage when it needs to be taken? When you're walking through your church and there's a piece of trash on the ground, are you willing to pick it up? If we're talking about the mundane, the menial, and even for pastors, are we willing to grab the weed whacker and trim the weeds that are growing up around the outside of our building?
Right.
I think it speaks to servanthood leadership, and how Christ offers an example of what love looks like, and you can play that out in even just taking care of the church building or the church property, as a form of love for anyone in the church.
For one another.
I have some great saints in my church who commit hours every week to preparing the space so that those can come and worship and not have to worry about the cleanliness of the pews or anything like that. It's simple, and it's not necessarily,
It's not glamorous.
not at all pretty, but they are forms of love.
Neither is washing people's feet.
Certainly not. Certainly not.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned this, Danny, and I bring up the quote in my essay from Dostoevsky, that as soon as somebody's face is shown, love is gone. And this is what Ivan, the atheist brother, says, that you cannot actually love somebody that you know. And Soren Kierkegaard echoes something in the Works of Love, which, if you have the wherewithal to read through that entire book before Sunday, that's thoroughly impressive. But I think that book is definitely worth checking out at some point in your ministry, or the Brothers Karamazov, because there are those that we are closest to, we sometimes do not offer grace to. Like, we will gladly give to people who are outside of the church, and we will have different expectations for those who are outside of the church, and so we offer them greater grace. And like, well, they're not Christians, so of course they're going to be that way. But to those who are Christians, we have expectations. We have, well, you know better. You say that you love Jesus, so how dare you do this? And so the expectations that don't allow for us to offer others grace. I mean, this is, yes, Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him and still served him.
Right.
And you could even connect it to the how many times do I forgive my brother? Up to 7 times? No, 7 times 77.
Right. Except for you and I, Ryan, we always extended grace to each other.
Always.
Never bickered or fought.
I'm still sorry about that dinner. All right?
Yeah.
Get over it.
Any final thoughts before we close this episode? There's so much happening in this passage. This is such an important passage for the church. If you don't normally preach the lectionary, then you ought to this Sunday. This is too important of a passage.
I think one other thing that that needs to be mentioned is not just that Christians ought to, not that it's a good thing, but this is a missiological text.
Yes.
That if the world is, we are the body of Christ. If you want to read this intertextually, the church is the body of Christ, right? We are Jesus' ambassadors. We are the ones who are to go and make disciples of all nations. But the proof that we are Jesus' disciples is our love for one another.
Yeah.
And perhaps this is an opportunity to talk about the lack of ecumenical work, or perhaps to encourage ecumenical work with other churches. Christian unity is something that we all want, and yeah, it's definitely something worth doing, but how many preachers cross denominational lines and create work projects? On a local level it happens, but I also think that it's a shame that so many denominations exist in their own little camps. Theologically speaking, there's not a whole lot of difference between the Wesleyan churches. We have policy differences, and there's power and money involved, but I know plenty of United Methodists that could articulate Christian perfection the exact same way that we would say entire sanctification. And I think one of the testimonies against the church is our denominations. Many people who are unchristian are like, well, what church should I belong to? I don't think the path forward is through non-denominationalism, because I consider those micro-denominations. But perhaps this is a text that should push church leaders and denominational leaders to consider, are we, by setting up our camps, not showing the love that we have for one another?
Right, so being missiological, within the local church, our communities are going to know we're disciples by the way that we love one another. But then also, within our communities, perhaps our towns or cities will know that we are Christians by the way we love our sisters and brothers of other denominations or other traditions. And then maybe that goes all the way up to the global level.
Yeah, so when Wesleyans slight Calvinists, or when you say, oh, well, that's the Catholics, And most of us who are using the lectionary probably get accused of being Catholics from time to time, especially if we're ones that emphasize the sacraments. Hopefully our congregations are realizing that there is there's a great affinity between the multiple traditions, and we can learn from one another, and we're on the same team.
Right.
We're not.
I think a good connection point for the laity in our congregations to kind of start to enact that in some very tangible ways is to highlight the juxtaposition between Christ's glorification and what we glorify. Christ glorified himself by washing feet, taking up the cross, serving in some very tangible, real ways. So maybe a challenge would be, what is it that we glorify? What are the things that we see as awe-inspiring and clamor around when, walking around the church building and picking up the trash? We need to be sure to glorify those sorts of things. To go and serve somebody who's homebound and can't get up on Sunday mornings to come to a church. Are we glorifying that in our community? Are we doing well to point glory where glory is due?
Right.
Because I think our misunderstanding is that we have to be good in order to receive God's love, when it is God's love that makes us good. And doing these sorts of acts of service is what should be glorified and points to the glory of God in the present context.
Right.
And you could even point to, parachurch organizations, if there are any that your church is engaged with in the community, where you could say, like, it's these types of things. I think sometimes we shouldn't, but I still say that sometimes Christians believe that service is optional. Or that my service is coming to church on Sundays. When yes, we are bringing an offering in worship of our time and energy and of ourselves, we are offering ourselves to God. But worship should be an expression of the work that we have been doing all week. That it's our lives as Christians who love one another should manifest in tangible ways. And there you could maybe bring in James.
Right. Well, there's a lot for us to chew on in terms of our sermon preparation this Sunday. There's for such a short passage, there's so much for us to dissect, and there's so much for us to preach on. So our challenge to you this week is to preach well, once again, the resurrection of Jesus. This is a new thing Jesus is doing. And there's a new commandment that Jesus has given, to love one another in the way that he has loved us, sacrificially in service. So preach well the glorification of the resurrection, which is service and self-sacrifice on this Sunday. Any final words from the two of you before we close?
Go, Duke.
Well, great to be with you this week, Ryan. Thanks for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you, and thanks for your contribution on the website.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Go in peace.